Welcome back to Capitol Hill Ocean Talk, live from Washington, D.C. at Capitol Hill Ocean Week 2017. I'm your host, Kate Thompson. How do you farm a better fish? Aquaculture techniques enable researchers and producers to farm freshwater and marine fish, shellfish, and plants. Today we'll be talking about the current science behind aquaculture and how this industry is adapting to changing conditions. Joining me in the studio today is Dr. Michael Rubino, Director of the Office of Aquaculture at NOAA Fisheries. With Michael at the helm, the Office of Aquaculture fosters marine aquaculture through policy, science, technology, outreach, and international collaboration. I'm also joined by Chris Tellini, Assistant Manager of the Aquaculture Research Center at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. At the Aquaculture Research Center, Chris and other researchers investigate aquaculture system designs, sustainable nutrition, development of Chesapeake Bay commercial seafood species, and more. Also in the studio with us is Nick King, Operations Director for the Fish Vet Group, a total aquaculture health company that provides a holistic approach to the prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of diseases in aquatic animals. We'll also speak with Eric Pedersen, President of Great American Aquaculture. Under Eric's leadership, Great American Aquaculture is launching one of the nation's largest commercial recirculating aquaculture facilities. And last, but certainly not least, we're joined by my colleague, Alan Tom, Director of the Pacific Islands region for NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries. Alan is responsible for overseeing management and science within national marine sanctuaries and marine national monuments in Hawaii and American Samoa. Don't forget to join our discussion by tweeting us with the hashtag #Chow2017, and we will answer them live on the show. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for joining me in the studio today. I'm really excited to talk about this extremely important topic. So, Michael, what exactly is aquaculture? Can you walk us through some of the history of it?
Sure. Simply, aquaculture is the farming of aquatic animals and plants. Think fish, oysters, and seaweed. And we as humans have been doing this in one form or another really for eons, for centuries. But modern aquaculture, bringing animals into the barnyard, so closing the life cycle from hatchery through market size, is really a product of the last 40 years or so. In the United States, it started with catfish farming and trout farming around the country. More recently, we've had a steady growth in marine aquaculture, so oysters, clams, mussels, seaweed, salmon, and now marine fish. And with this boom in oyster production, all of my kids after work go out and eat oysters on the half shell and drink beer at pubs. It's become a phenomenon around the country. Well, that's led to a big increase in oyster production around the country and lots of jobs in coastal communities and a whole new generation of folks from seafood and fishing families going into aquaculture. It's quite a generational change. The other thing that's happening is where the new frontiers of aquaculture are to go further offshore to get away from some of the coastal land use conflicts in coastal areas, as well as coming on land and growing marine species in tanks and recirculating systems.
Well, Chris, I mean, why would you want to even farm a fish? It seems like a very difficult process to get done right.
It is, and there's various different ways of doing it. There's extremely intensive ways, and then there's unintensive ways in pond farming and such. I'm sure Eric might be asking himself why he decided to farm fish right now, but
my wife does.
Oh, your wife, exactly. But yeah, one of the issues we have is, as we all know here, that the oceans are sort of at peak capacity, what they can provide for seafood for the world. So global harvests have plateaued since the 80s, and aquaculture has actually made up the difference in the increase in demand throughout the world. So the United States imports roughly 80 or 90% of their seafood. Half of that's farmed, mostly in China. So I think it's important in the U.S. that we expand the aquaculture production in order to get some food security, to reduce that trade deficit, create some jobs in the U.S. in an industry that's really going to be growing whether it's done here or not. I mean, it's going to happen somewhere.
Right. So Nick, we've mentioned lots of different things that we farm. Can you tell us about some of the major aquaculture industries?
Sure. If we look at the global aquaculture production, it sits at around 70 million metric tons. As Chris just said, most of that's produced in China, 60% in fact. So, and that's in the form of freshwater fishes like carp, followed by mollusks and shrimp. And so if we take the 60% that goes to China, or that's produced in China, another 25% is then the rest of Asia, which leaves about 15% produced in the rest of the world, and the rest of the world in terms of aquaculture is Africa, Europe, and the Americas. That translates to about 10.5 million metric tons, of which the United States is the 0.5, the 500,000 metric tons. So global aquaculture is happening. It is a global marketplace. It is a global production. And here in the U.S., we are, working in many different areas, as Michael said. It's mollusks, it's catfish, it's salmon, it's shrimp. And we've gotten very good at, here in the U.S., doing some of these early life stage challenges in the hatcheries, studying species, trying to see if they are prime candidates for aquaculture development. We have an excellent academic and scientific base here with some support and funding. They've really solved a lot of the bottlenecks and problems and trying to make it work here.
So I don't want to say that we have good and bad farms, but there's got to be some kind of way to make it a successful aquaculture enterprise. What makes one successful? Certainly
management, for sure. Success really, it starts with finding the right product. What am I going to produce? How am I going to produce it, and what kind of a system? Once you figure out those details and you've designed and built your farm, it comes down to management. It comes down to people. People grow your fish. And you have to manage people, and you have to manage the process of how to do it. So I would definitely say the success of one farm or hatchery is different by the way they manage their program. Right. Well, Chris, I've been up to your facility up in Baltimore. It's really, really impressive, and you have the whole process right there. Mm-hmm. So can you walk us through how does a fish go from aquaculture facility to me, the consumer, buying it at a grocery store?
Sure. It starts with a brood stock. They're usually on-site domesticated, or some farms do rely on wild-caught brood stock, and they'll strip spawn them and take the eggs back to the hatchery. Then starts the larviculture stage, which for some species is fairly simple, like salmonids. They just start to swim up and start eating prepared diet right away. Some other species will need a little bit more TLC. They need to be fed essentially cultured plankton, rotifers, artemia, daphnia, copepods. And there's companies that do just that. They are just commercial hatcheries, and they will sell either the fertilized eggs, they'll sell the larvae, or they'll actually raise them to fingerlings and sell them to facilities to grow out. Whether that facility is a tank-based system or if it's a net pen, it can be a pond. The trout industry, there's a lot are just basically diverted streams, and they make a series of ponds that run in succession, and the water just goes out the other end. So it's sort of all over the spectrum in terms of how the actual fish is grown. But it's basically using prepared diets. That's an area that's receiving a lot of attention now in terms of sustainability due to the fact that traditionally aquaculture diets were just harvesting wild fish, adding some other land-based crop products, vitamins, turning it into essentially a pellet, looks pretty much like dog food, and throwing it into the pen, and then when they get to market size, they harvest them. But there's actually a really big industry right now in looking at some other protein sources that don't rely on fish meal, some yeast things, bacterial cultures, some crop isolates like soy, barley. So it's a pretty exciting area actually right now, and it's growing, and that's something Nick has a lot of experience with in his past with spreading. Right. So.
Well, Eric, when people hear of aquaculture, they tend to think of farmed seafood. Federal nutrition guidelines recommend that Americans double their seafood consumption due to the health benefits of it. But how can we balance that? How can we make intelligence decisions about what we buy in the grocery store?
Well, you're right, Kate. There's a lot of mixed messages going on to the American consumer right now. They're on one hand being told, increase your seafood consumption, it's good for you, it's good for your brain, it's good for the brains of your developing infants. On the other hand, be careful about the mercury, be careful about the PCBs. These are issues that are difficult to come to terms with. There's also new evidence to suggest that there's mislabeling and misidentification of species at the point of sale. And then there's this issue around, what is sustainability? And are sustainably produced seafood items, good for me to eat? Do they taste good? So the consumer really has to sort out a number of issues to navigate safely down the seafood aisle. And I recommend really 3 simple guidelines. The first one is, buy American, and wherever possible, buy local. If you buy from a local source, you are reasonably guaranteed that the fish was produced, the seafood product was produced in a sustainable manner, in a way that will be good for the community and just fresh. and not produced in a way that could be injurious to the family. The second thing you want to do is you want to find a good, trusted supplier of seafood products and ask them questions. Any good retail store that sells fish will be able to tell you a lot about the origin of the fish, when it was harvested, how long they've had it, and specifically what the species is. Even restaurants now are organizing their sales force around educating their sales staff, their waiters and waitresses, to be knowledgeable as a way of engaging with the diner and a way of developing a more consultative relationship as the diner orders food off the menu. And then really lastly, avoid red-listed issues in seafood products. Most of these are clearly, identified in the grocery store, at the retail market. And if you're unable to find something immediately apparent, use one of the pocket guides that are produced by organizations like Monterey Bay Aquarium's Seafood Watch. These are easy to keep around and provide a very clear listing of what to avoid.
Right. So, Michael, what is NOAA doing with regards to aquaculture policy? We have all these issues. How do you get through it? And I know the government has a hand in trying to figure that out. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. When NOAA is the country's marine science agency and management agency in terms of natural marine resources. And we've spent a lot of the last 10 or 15 years working with commercial and recreational fishermen and a variety of other stakeholders like state governments to end overfishing, to put all of our wild stocks under management programs. And we've also been working on habitat conservation, so the recruitment areas for fisheries. But the third leg of marine management in terms of seafood is once you've got smart fishing and habitat conservation is what else can you do with that resource? And the obvious answer is to grow seafood. In the United States, that's complicated because aquaculture is kind of the new kid on the block in terms of use of the marine environment. We've already got fishing and shipping lanes and tourism and recreation and coastal landowners who are concerned about viewscapes. Everyone loves to have a wind farm as long as it's someplace else. Well, aquaculture has that same issue of not in my backyard. And in addition, we inherited the English town system where everybody gets a say. We have local, state, federal regulations that often conflict and overlap with each other. It's a tough gauntlet for a business to go through in terms of obtaining permits. So one of the things NOAA's doing is to take leadership amongst the federal family to come up with a streamlined regulatory process, not to reduce regulations, but to make them more efficient, to do it on a more programmatic basis. And we're doing that by bringing science to the table. So knowledge of the marine environment, the GIS planning tools in terms of location and siting, looking at water column and benthic or seafloor effects in terms of models, looking at genetic models and escape models, so that we have those proper tools for rules to make sure that we have good management.
Right.
The other thing we do is aquaculture is also a tool for restoration of endangered species. So we're working on using hatchery techniques to restore white abalone on the West Coast, Atlantic salmon, some of the coral species, as well as using hatcheries for restoration purposes of oyster reefs, for example.
Okay, so your office, as well as the National Centers for Coastal and Ocean Science, are really leading the way for aquaculture research in NOAA. Can you tell us about the specific research that's been going on?
Sure. One example is as we move further offshore, we avoid some of the coastal land use conflicts of the near shore, but there are other issues that get raised. For example, there's a developer who would like to put a fish farm in federal waters off San Diego, which would be one of the first fish farms in federal waters. But they ran into issues of, well, you're right in the middle of Navy testing areas and Navy shipping lanes and submarine practice areas. So that led to a whole conversation with the Navy, the Coast Guard, taking our GIS mapping tools and working with a wide variety of federal and state agencies and the private developer to look at where could you best locate fish farms from the perspective of growing fish, but also in terms of avoiding those user conflicts.
Right. So Alan, what types of aquacultures are actually taking place in marine protected areas like national marine sanctuaries? I mean, they're all the way from Stellwagen Bank off of Massachusetts to the Florida Keys to off of California. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on in sanctuaries?
Sure. So to pick up, where Michael left off, the issue of can aquaculture coexist in national marine sanctuaries? Kate, as you know, we have 14 national marine sanctuaries and marine monuments, and they're multi-use. They have different regulations in different places. And so I did check in with my colleagues on the East Coast and the West Coast. Reed Boney from the East Coast tells me that we have coral farms in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. So again, that's a little one-off perhaps for what is really the official term for aquaculture. But the coral farming then goes to supplant, income for folks. On the West Coast, Bill Duros tells me we have oyster farms in Tomales Bay. I believe there's abalone grow out in Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. And certainly in my region in the Pacific, there is not only traditional aquaculture, but high-tech aquaculture and cage culture off of the Big Island. So there's a variety of things that happen in national marine sanctuaries. And on some level, sanctuaries do support some of these activities.
Well, in Hawaii, the culture is so strong there, and for thousands of years they've been doing things sustainably, whether because of their ahupu'a, or their land to their sea. Anything that happens up in the mountains, impacts the ocean. Can you tell us a little bit about some of these fish ponds that they're trying to reinvigorate in their culture?
Sure. So actually, fish ponds exist throughout Polynesia and Micronesia. They're just they're called different things. Fish ponds in Hawaii have existed for decades, and what you're seeing here is a map of the Ahupua'a system, the land division. That is one whole community that basically owns the top of the ridge all the way down to the reef. And the fish pond at the bottom is a rock wall that goes outside into the ocean and grows fish out. So basically the community would catch larval fish, feed them for maybe up to years until the fish were fat enough, and we're talking things like milkfish and mullet. But there's different kinds of fish ponds. There are fish ponds inland, there are fish ponds that are only freshwater, there are fish ponds that are only saltwater, and this kind of mimics what goes on now on the mainland. So this is a picture of the fish pond off of my office. That's the Humpback Whale Sanctuary office in Kihei, Maui. That's a 3-acre fish pond called a loko ia, which is a fish pond that goes out into the ocean. That is currently being restored. That will never be a fish pond that is currently going to raise fish to feed a community. Instead, that's going to be a fish pond to be a demonstration project, to show the community this is what happens in a fish pond. And what's very nice about, I think, the Pacific is that you have a generation of folks that are growing up, or youngsters growing up, learning that they can be aquaculturists, that they can raise fish, and this is how you do it. So that's going to be a teaching tool. This is also a teaching tool if you have to restore the fish pond. So this is not a concrete raceway where you have to go in and just drain the pond. You actually have to go and stack the rocks. This is Kimukeo Kapolehua. He's the gentleman behind this fish pond's restoration. He was the Capitol Hill Oceans Week first ever volunteer of the year many, many years ago. So good to acknowledge him, but good to see what the work that he actually does on a day-to-day basis. So this is something that's ongoing in Hawaii.
Yeah, I've been out to the fish pond on Molokai, and it's huge, like 40 acres.
Yep.
They are really doing some amazing work out there, and the pride that they take in it. I mean, that gentleman Hanu right there told me this is my backyard, this is my office, and I take care of it, and it's amazing the cultural appreciation that they have for the resource.
Yeah, and you probably don't want to go fish in his fish pond unless he tells you to.
Yeah, right.
And so my analogy, because I live in the world of marine protection, is that these fish ponds and the fish ponds throughout Polynesia belong to the community, and heaven forbid a commoner like me from a different area goes in and fishes in that area, you get your head cut off. So that is a best type of enforcement for not only aquaculture but for marine protection. But it's nice to see this renovation, and what we learn from these fish ponds can be adapted to Western science as well.
Yes. Can I pick up on that?
Yeah, sure.
So one interesting thing is we're discovering more recently that native fish ponds have been in existence all up and down the west coast of the United States as well. Not just for fish, but also for shellfish. And going back for centuries. And there's some Native Americans who are still maintaining some of those ponds, especially for shellfish farming. And by studying where those are, we're learning a lot about how to restore native species. Yeah. In terms of the sort of the centuries of learning about where the best places to do these are.
Yeah, can I just add to that?
Yeah.
So that that when you look at the native Hawaiian fish ponds, they weren't just willy-nilly placed all over.
Right.
They were placed in strategic locations, either at the mouth of a stream or where there's going to be high turnover of the water, so you don't need some kind of aerator going on. There were reasons, and I think we've done a lot of studies. We supported a lot of studies to figure out, well, what's the process of restoring a fish pond, but why was that fish pond there in the first place?
Right. Well, we actually have a couple questions from Facebook Live already. So, Eric, what goes into deciding which kinds of fish and seafood to farm? Anne's asking that question.
So yeah, that's really where it has to start. And I think part of what we're doing at Great American Aquaculture is redefining what the word fish farmer means. And that means that the producer really now has to be integrally involved in understanding the pricing, the demand, the distribution channel, the pathway to market for a particular species, how much is produced by other producers, and really understand the demand and supply curve for that particular seafood item. And rather than starting with a great engineered system that can produce a specific species for which nobody may really actually want to buy. And that oftentimes is how it's been started. Then you have to go in to find, what is the right production method? And there are all different ways of producing seafood. You can use sea cages, inland reserves, and flow-through systems. And then there's recirculating aquaculture, which is what we're doing, in Waterbury, Connecticut. We're growing a species called European sea bass there in an entirely closed containment, self-contained system.
Then the follow-up question from Anne is, how do you encourage the farming of certain fish over others? I don't know, maybe Nick, you could take that.
Right, and just to add to what Eric's saying, I mean, if you're in a position where you're trying to decide, I'm going to set up a fish farm, you have to make some decisions. It's very much market-driven. I'd say Eric would agree there that you need to understand it's a business. Yes, we are going to do aquaculture to produce protein and feed people, but at the stage we're at, which is the leading edge of the industry, we really need to have viable businesses to develop. And so it starts with what am I going to grow, and can I sell it, and can I get a high value price? Because we're not jumping in with massive production farms. We're doing small scale up. And in order to survive those early stages, you really have to optimize the price of your product so that you can feed it back into the business and grow.
So Eric, what should the objectives be, you think, for the aquaculture industry in the U.S.?
Well, I think we need to grow. That should be number one. And to do that, we're going to have to become, the gold standard globally of aquaculture practices. And that means, how we grow the fish, what types of sustainability practices do we observe. The quality of the product has to be, absolutely beyond question. And these, we have to galvanize as an industry to figure out how to do this. We have to be able to innovate. We have to be able to figure out a way to pull cost out, make seafood more affordable, remove ocean resources as part of the diet for aquacultured fish, and find ways to educate the consumer accurately, giving, a clear picture of what the determinants are as they think about buying seafood items, and provide that information in a clear and easy to access way.
So another question from Josh on Facebook Live is, how do you ensure feed for farmed fish is sustainable? Maybe Chris?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it's becoming much easier to do that. Most of the feed suppliers, if you contact them, will tell you they won't tell you necessarily the proportions or where they got, but they will, that's proprietary, but they will tell you what their main feed stuff is. And if you look on every bag of seafood of fish food you buy, the ingredients are all listed. And it's the same as nutritional labeling. The first one is the most plentiful. So typically in the past 20 years, you just see fish meal was the first one, always fish meal. But now you're seeing a lot more of these other things. I talked about the single cell protein sources. Polychaete is actually looking at as a pretty promising thing, and the trick is how to grow polychaete worms. They actually have a very good protein and lipid profile. Most of the feed manufacturers you will contact will be extremely honest about where they got their feed, and if they're not, I'd look somewhere else.
Nick?
And sustainability is always been important. I would say, as Chris mentioned, back 30 years ago, it was all fish meal and fish oil, but the feed companies that were investing in R&D, and these are the large global feed companies that are responding to the industries that they support. Sustainability is a market-driven thing, so the clients who the farms are selling their product to are asking for sustainability in feed. And that's going back up the ladder to the feed companies and driving their R&D focus. So yes, protein replacement is a big one. And okay, if you're going to use protein from a fishery, then let's make sure the fishery itself is sustainable that we're harvesting from.
Right.
And there are accreditations
Right.
that follow that.
Right. Michael, what are you predicting in terms of the expansion for aquaculture? Earlier, you had mentioned that fisheries is working very, very hard to ensure that stocks are brought back up to healthy levels, and that we do regulating when we need to. But we obviously know that in the next 30, 40, 50 years, if we're going to double our increase our intake of fish, we're going to have to go further with aquaculture. So what do you think the expansion will be driven by? Private sector, government entities, or both?
Well, I think ultimately it's being driven by the consumer and the private sector. Just if you want to do a little tour around the country, on the East Coast, we're seeing an uptake in interest in, as I mentioned, oyster clam mussel farming. The latest one is seaweed farming. Not just in the Northeast in terms of sea vegetables or sea greens as they're being branded, but the latest area of interest is seaweed farming in Alaska, where it's cold, where things like sugar and bull kelp grow quite well, and where it provides alternative employment for fishermen during the off-season, so that they have year-round employment. So the species will vary by region. In terms of fish, we may see striped bass on the East Coast, red drum in the Gulf, yellowtail species in Southwest California, and then some of the native Hawaiian species in Hawaii.
Right. But if the U.S. is trying to push things, Eric, you had mentioned this earlier, buy local. But the other thing is, though, we've got this huge globe, this huge world of one ocean that's completely impacted by what everybody does. So how can we take what's happening in the U.S. or Canada or any other place that's working really hard on researching the best techniques for aquaculture? How do we take that and work with countries like China to ensure, since they're sending us the most stuff, how do we make sure that things are done well and work together on them?
Well, I think as Michael pointed out, this is going to be driven by the private sector and by the consumer. It will be assisted by governmental agencies and regulatory changes. But basically the consumer has to say, I'm not going to buy products that I don't know how they were produced and I don't know where they came from. And this is happening already, Kate. We're seeing this in the marketplace today. It's being driven by the consumer and then adopted by the commercial organization, whether it's the grocery retailer or the restaurant chain that's matching demand with supply.
Right.
The Whole Foods is a great example of
the
amount of fish meal. They have a finite level that can be used in the fish feeds that are fed. So they're not doing that on their own. They're doing that because the customers want that. So they're basically setting the guidelines for what the industry will dictate. Right. So I think it's very much customer driven.
We have another question from Jen on Twitter. Are there areas in the U.S. that have adopted integrated fish farming? Anyone?
Absolutely. And I think what they're talking about is the coupling of fish production with other types of species in an integrated system. And this is commonly known as aquaponics. I'm affiliated with another organization in St. Paul, Minnesota called Urban Organics. And Urban Organics grows Arctic char and uses the waste products from the fish production system to provide fertilizer for leafy greens and culinary herbs, and produces, in effect, two products, a vegetable product and a seafood product in a closed system where there are very, very little waste products. The fish waste is used as the nutrient source for the plants. It's a very elegant system. It's local. It provides the immediate community with a source of sustainable and high quality food.
Yeah, the other area where this is happening is in the marine environment, and it's called integrated multi-trophic aquaculture. I'd love to take you up to Portland, not to Portland, to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Uh-huh. And the Fishermen's Co-op in Portsmouth, New Hampshire has been working with the Sea Grant program on growing steelhead trout, mussels on the outside of the fish cages, and then algae on the outside of that. Yeah. And they received a permit from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to grow fish in an area that was already nutrient limited because of all the runoff from land, in part because the mussels and the algae are uptaking the waste product from the fish. And that small-scale model is now going to be adopted in several places in Maine, and there's interest in the Gulf of Mexico, off California, and elsewhere around the country. to do that kind of a small-scale integrated aquaculture model.
Well, I know that we've come leaps and bounds with aquaculture and people understanding a little bit more about aquaculture. But when I first heard about it, I was just like, oh, will the fish taste the same? Will it, I mean, really? It farmed? So what are some of those misconceptions about aquaculture, and how do we differentiate between international and US-based aquaculture?
Well, I think all of us grew up with our parents or our older siblings reading stories to us about cows and pigs and farms.
Right.
We know what a family farm is, but we don't know what a family fish farm or an oyster farm looks like. It's not part of our sort of cultural experience. And so bringing that knowledge to bear to the general public, I think, is going to take another generation. Certainly in the early days of this current version of aquaculture, there were lots of mistakes made. Fish farms were put in the wrong places, they crammed too many animals in together, and that tainted some forms of aquaculture in the public's mind. But there's been a huge amount of learning in the past 20 to 30 years about what to do and what not to do. And that learning is now being brought to bear in aquaculture of all forms. The other thing we've learned is in comparison to terrestrial agriculture, aquaculture is one of the most efficient ways to produce food. It takes very little feed to produce fish or shrimp. And for mollusks, it requires no feed at all, or seaweed, no feed at all. Yes, there are environmental questions, as there are with any human activity. But as I said, we now have that 30 years of learning about what to do and what not to do. And we're putting that science to work.
Right. Before I get to the last question for everyone, I wanted to ask Alan, what do you think that we can learn from not just native Hawaiian intelligence, but indigenous intelligence when it comes to this kind of thing?
Well, that's a different panel.
Yeah, right.
What I see in my little corner of the world is that aquaculture does not have any kind of bad reputation. People want a fresh fish. They would prefer to see it come out of that fish pond or wherever it is they're going to and eat that right then and there. And I think like the community of Molokai where you've been to and you see all those fish ponds and people just buy the fish right then and there. That's probably, where perhaps the mainland could be headed, is like if you had a fish shack. I believe out in Oahu there was a place called Am Orient Fish Farm. And they had a fish shack there, and you would buy the shrimp right out of the raceway, and it was like one of the biggest money makers in restaurant anywhere on that island. And maybe that might be a hybrid for some of the aquaculture farms, is to just have a restaurant located next to it. So there's a business thing there too.
Yeah.
I do think the acceptance is regional, though. I mean, in a place like Hawaii, I think it's much more accepted there. I'm from Buffalo, New York originally, and anytime I tell people what I do for a living, I would say 1 in 3 people just think the dog. What? You raise fish in a farm? They don't really never heard of it. They don't, and they just one of the answers I always get is, well, it's not natural. And I always think, I'm like, well, is chicken farming natural? Is pig like? Right. Go to a restaurant or grocery store, and if you can find something else that's wild harvested other than seafood, I'll give you $100. And not to say that wild caught seafood doesn't have a place, but. Right. It's just we need to get over that perception that fish farming is bad.
I would add that the U.S. consumer has accepted aquaculture. If you look at the top 10 seafoods that we consume, most of them are aquaculture: shrimp, salmon, tilapia. They occupy the top 5. So the consumer has accepted the fact that their seafood is coming from aquaculture because they're buying it and they're consuming it. Now we're just talking about differentiation, between products and how they're grown and how they're produced.
Right. Well, and I know this is tough in one sentence, gentlemen, but in one sentence, I would like each of you to tell me what you think the future of aquaculture is. Michael.
So I get to start.
Yes.
Oh boy.
Well, I hope that when I'm reading bedtime stories to my grandchildren, or maybe my great-grandchildren, that they will be as familiar with oysters, clams, mussels, and fish, and understand what the concept of seafood farming is instinctively, the same way we currently understand the family farm.
The future, my opinion is the future of fish farming is going to be, I think it's going to be fairly regional. I think it's going to be the species that are grown and the ways that they are grown in areas are going to differ quite a bit from one another. And again, back to that whole thing, the consumers are going to drive what that is. You can't just grow a fish that nobody wants and say, hey, I grew this fish, it's great protein, eat it. People aren't going to buy it, they're not going to buy it. So I think it really is going to be regionally dictated as to what that consumer base will buy.
Right.
I'd say it's really exciting that we are on the leading edge of a new industry here, and that, you know, just like Michael said, I expect someday to speak about how I was part of the industry development of aquaculture someday. What's it going to look like? I think it's going to be quite diverse. We've been, like I said earlier, very good at understanding life stages and closing the life cycle on a lot of different species of fish and shellfish. And so our future is sort of everything, coastal, offshore, and between our coasts where food is produced in quite a diverse nature of species and systems.
Right.
I think it's simple. It's products manufactured and produced by Great American Aquaculture. The future holds.
No shameless plug there.
Listen, we're live, so I can get away with this. Right? The future is bright, I think, for all forms of aquaculture and for artisanal, wild catch fisheries. Right. There's a lot of different ways to produce safe, sustainable seafood in this country. Working together is going to be key, and I really believe that's already underway, evidenced by this panel.
Got it. Alan?
I think it is the future. I mean, growing up in Hawaii, we never would ever eat a tilapia. And I go now to McCormick and Schmidt, and it's $23. And yet I know that's not a wild-caught tilapia, so it's got to be aquacultured. So I think it has happened. I think that there are probably hurdles that the industry has overcome, and I think it's probably already accepted in many places of the world.
I think I agree. I have to say just one word: future.
Yeah.
We don't have a choice.
Yeah.
So,
No, exactly. Yeah, it's got to happen.
Yeah. So thank you, gentlemen, so much for joining me today.
you.
This has been a very engaging conversation, and I look forward to seeing all the future that comes forward. And I'll, of course, keep stopping and seeing what's going on with Chris in his facility.
You're welcome anytime. Anytime.
So thanks again. And thank you all for joining me in this lightning discussion. I'll certainly be looking differently at aquaculture raised seafood in the future, and I bet our viewers will as well. So at 1:30, Capitol Hill Ocean Week will continue with a discussion on the interconnection of land and sea. Then we'll be back at 3 p.m. Eastern with our final Capitol Hill Ocean Talk of the year about how technology can support sustainable fisheries. We'll see you then. Thanks for watching.